Hello, Jeff Zwerink here, and welcome back to Give and Take, the segment of our show where we explore important scientific ideas to help you be more confident in the truth of Christianity. Today I'm excited because we have Dr. Gavin Ortlund back. We are going to be discussing whether death in creation is a good thing or not. Gavin, it's good to have you back.
Thanks, good to be here.
Again, I just appreciate your background in historical theology. That's where you have a PhD. I know you're a pastor, First Baptist Church in Ojai. I know those two things you've got to have wrestled with, the length of creation days and death before the fall and these sorts of things. So how do we think about death before the fall? I know that's not something recently that's talked about, and I know people have talked about that throughout history. So what insight can you bring to that discussion?
Yeah, well, I think for starters, I would say this is one of the most emotional parts of this debate over creation. And in some ways, it's where you get into where the deeper issues lie about how do we understand createdness and fallenness? Because some people would look at a lion eating a gazelle and say, that's why the world is fallen, that's evil.
Right.
Other people would say, actually, that's the way God set it up to work, and that's not necessarily evil. It may be unpleasant for the gazelle in the moment,
right?
But it's not necessarily evil. So,
it seems to have this implication of God's character. It's like, how could God do that? That can't be the God we serve type things.
Yeah, and there's sometimes strong judgments made upon those behaviors, as though if that were the way God set up the world, God himself would be the author of evil.
Right.
And so this issue does get into some pretty important implications in terms of how we view God and how we understand what creation is.
Well, I know you've done some work studying Gustin, and he's a prominent theologian who's influenced a lot of the theology that Orthodox Christendom thinks about today, or that is Orthodox thought in Christendom today. What did Gustin have to say about this?
Yeah, he's a fun person to engage on this. He talked a lot about insects and a lot about carnivores, and basically was very strong in his assertion that these are good things that God made, and he actually rebukes those who sit in judgment upon them. And part of that comes from his own historical context. He lived in the 4th and 5th centuries, and there was a religion called Manichaeism back in those days. And the
Is that a sect of Christianity, or is that something entirely different?
It's outside of Orthodox Christianity. Yeah.
Okay.
So the Manichaeans, they were dualists. They believe good and evil are kind of equal up cosmically, and they think that animal death is a bad thing, and so they're sitting in judgment upon this as an example of why the world wasn't good and why Genesis 1 saying the world was good is wrong. And so he's responding to them. And in the context of that response, he has a lot to say about how some things can appear unpleasant to us, but we should be careful. We should have humility in the judgments that we make. We don't want to say that something God did is bad, if in fact God did set up the world in this way. Right.
Well, and I find that interesting, just that discussion there, and I'm going to draw a blank on which psalm it is, but I remember reading through the Psalms, and there's one where the lion is roaring about for its prey, and God is providing it for it. That it really does have this connotation of God doing that, and God's being praised for that. It's not like, oh, this is awful, how could this be? So
exactly.
It's not as trivial to think about this issue when you're really wrestling with what Scripture has to say about it, sounds like.
I think that's right. I think that's Psalm 104.
Yeah.
And the lions and then a few other carnivores are in there too. So and Augustine looks at that. He acknowledges the struggle of that. But he basically has this idea of temporal beauty, which is just a way of saying some things are beautiful for a season. And so he's basically saying death can be a good thing in that it leads to a certain kind of beauty. He calls it the lowest form of beauty. And the metaphor that he uses at one point that I think is helpful is like the passing of seasons. He has that idea for the whole natural order. Death allows God to create more kinds of animals, more individual animals, and it leads to a kind of beauty in the passing from one thing to another.
So the beauty isn't necessarily in the death, but the death is part of a bigger thing that God's putting in place that is beautiful.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, and he really wants to caution people in the judgments they make about that, because he's saying, look, you're seeing one thing, but look at it in context. Look at this one instance in relation to the bigger picture. And this is one of the things you guys at Reasons to Believe helpfully point out a lot is, okay, it might be sad for the gazelle when it gets eaten, but think what would happen if it didn't. You know, if there was no death of any kind, what kind of world would that be? It would
Right.
not be an inhabitable world. It would not be possible because it would be extremely overpopulated very fast.
Yeah, it would look very different than what we see, and we assume that it would be better. But I actually find it interesting is that there are scientific studies that shows what happens when carnivores aren't around, or when the things that are designed to degrade debris are not around, and it doesn't end up well. So it's just interesting, that concept of humility. It's, we have this presumption of what it will be, but often when we look in, it looks different.
Exactly. And he uses a great metaphor to kind of impress upon us the need for humility. He says, imagine that there's a layperson going into a mechanic's shop.
Right.
And they don't know what any of the instruments do. They're not a mechanic. But they cut themselves on one of the instruments as they walk by. And then from that experience, they say this entire workshop is evil.
Okay.
Well, they're making a judgment based upon their own personal momentary pain without a consideration of the whole point of what these instruments are doing. They don't actually know what they're designed to do. And Gustin uses that metaphor in this context to talk about carnivores and say we should be careful in the judgments that we make because we don't see the bigger picture that God sees. And I think that's a simple point, but I actually think it's a really helpful point to remember in these discussions.
Yeah, it seems like that is a great takeaway. It's like, rather than getting, let's stick on the details, to step back and see, okay, what's God revealing and how do we deal with that? Gavin, I appreciate your comments. They've been very helpful today.
Thanks, Jeff.
When you're wrestling with creation and you're arguing that the earth is 4.5 billion years old, you must deal with this topic of death in creation. And we're so often inclined to make the judgment that death is bad. But I do think when you step back and look at a bigger picture of what God has revealed throughout Scripture and what Christians throughout history have said, that the theology that goes into death and what's going on, that I think there's a bigger picture there, that though it's a tense and difficult issue, that there is a way to really wrestle with that and see the beauty that God has put in creation, even if death is there. I would encourage you to go to gavinortlund.com and look for his article, The Missing Virtue in the Creation Debates, to understand the importance of humility and getting that bigger picture so that we can go out and share, even in these controversial topics, and have a way to articulate the gospel in a beautiful and powerful way.